We are greatly pleased to be able to introduce Congressman Joe Sestak, Admiral, who has given these questions a great deal of thought over many years and has been one of the preeminent voices working for the continued strength of our Navy. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. I'm actually on the Sea Power Subcommittee in Congress, and I had no intention of going there, but the 110th Congress, when I arrived, moved the V-22 out of, which is built in my district, out of the Air-Land Subcommittee and into the Sea Power Committee. So I had to change my preference of where to go at that time, just to kind of specify that often politics is very local. But I ended up on the Sea Power Committee, and there's very many good men and women on it that have much broader knowledge than I have when I arrived. At times I had some in-depth knowledge, but I came to really respect the breadth of what they brought to the table. And so I'm going to speak from my knowledge of having been there for a while, and with some of the tenets of my beliefs of what I felt was the proper role for the naval force in the future. And I think the title is a very good title for today. It's almost a provocative title in my mind, because I think the overarching question is, do we still want to measure the power of our military, whether it's our Air Force in the number of AEFs, whether it's our Army in the number of brigade combat teams, or whether it's our Navy in the number of ships, as to how powerful it is? Or is there a different measure that we should be attendant about in Congress, in defense industry, and in the Pentagon of benchmarking our real prowess? For example, naval posture, where you're positioned and what the capability is in whatever you position there to fight and win, and therefore deter our wars. And so I, some years ago, moved away from measuring the heft of our Navy's power by how many. Rather, to me, it was capability, and where that capability was postured in order to begin to measure with new tools that the Defense Department has had for a number of years, primarily modeling, to where it's no longer an admiral such as myself beginning to get Alzheimer's, where they put the first piece of paper on the table, having commanded a carrier battle group with the 5th Fleet, and say, I can tell you, I was there 5 years ago. Let me tell you, in 20 years, this is what you need. Maybe it's better to have an objective piece of paper on the table, one that comes out of some of the very fine modeling, and then say, let's bring in the heft of the experience of our warriors to see if that outcome is the correct answer. I bring that out because I honestly believe that, as you said, Alan, the future of our military has to remain preeminent. It has to. But the challenges that it's going through, I believe, is that to some degree I fear we're measuring ourselves with the wrong benchmark. So today, as I speak, I have two things that really forced the change in my way of thinking of it. The first was 9/11. Before 9/11, we liked away games. We liked our wars over there. After 9/11, we had home games. And so the Navy had to think through, how does it participate, if this is a security issue, in the home game as well as the away game? And then, if we recognize that our borders are quite transparent, or at least translucent, what is the capability the Navy can bring to those things that go across our borders, whether it's narco trades, whether it's illegal immigration, whether it's terrorists flowing back and forth or money laundering, or whether it's hidden nuclear weapons in a container ship coming up the Delaware River? The second was Iraq. Iraq was meaningful because it also said one of the two major regional contingencies we had based our war plans on was no longer attendant in the future war planning as far as the major force structure justification. We all know that we used to fight decades ago and based our war plans upon two major global conflicts at one time. And then the Nixon Doctrine in 1968, I think it was, what came to be called the Guam Doctrine, said it's 1.5 wars for us. And then General Powell did his wonderful work of trying to establish a plateau with 2 MTWs and then 2 MRCs and 2 of something. And during that time, the Navy understandably kept that wonderful and right argument about presence forward as part of its force structure justification. On aircraft carriers, we all know to keep in the mid takes about 4 or 5 in our force structure to keep that carrier on a 24/7 presence. So with those 2 pinpoints in mind, and an argument here is force structure really the right benchmark, or is it really force posture? And how do you measure that? When you have at one, and I'll take 3 pieces then under those 2 to go off, is on one extreme you have the global war on terror. On the other, as you look at what we have, and having understood that over the past 7 years, no Army unit could have, for example, deployed to South Korea. They just weren't ready. And yet, we were saying that was acceptable risk. We were fine. Despite brigades after divisions that were justified upon protecting South Korea, we have been fine over the past few years of letting that MRC at acceptable risk continue with the Navy and the Air Force responsible for its protection at acceptable risk, as the chairman of the Joint Staff said. So really, potentially, as one of the MRCs goes away, what is the other end of the benchmark? For me, reluctantly, but necessarily, since we're a conservative organization, or you are in the military, should be China. Not so much of us versus them, like the Soviet Union days, but almost as an honest broker in the Western Pacific, where you can just simply say to the other nations, no, don't worry, it could never be that country's day, because we have the posture and the capability to say it isn't. So potentially you don't need a Korea or a Japan to be overly concerned about a growing naval power, and therefore the influence it might have upon them, which may not be to our benefit. And in the middle, of course, across that entire spectrum should be presence. So let me take just a few examples of what I mean when we begin to speak about a Navy that, without a doubt, controls the great commons of the seas. Challenged at times, as Alan has said, but today it can control the commons of the seas. And it also can, wherever it places its carrier battle groups, often in conjunction with our Air Force, can control the great commons of airspace. But the commons I'd like to speak about more today is the commons that somehow I believe will really begin to have us measure ourselves, not by how many, but by capability, and that's the commons of cyberspace. How can you control it to know? So I could start with China, or global war of terror, but let's start with China. The modeling shows that in the worst case would be a sudden strike against some island that happens to sit off its coast. Minimum warning time is probably the harshest, even though it's a very, very low probability that our naval forces might have. How can you, within 96 hours, have 2 carrier battle groups, which the modeling tends to show you need at least that to be successful? And so you begin to think your way through this and say, we have, what do we have today? 11 or 10? Pardon? 11. I got into this political stuff, just so you know. I had no intention of being on the Defense Department when my daughter had her brain tumor. And as the Navy said it was time to go, nobody knew that. But I got into this because, frankly, I'm paying back the nation, you, because I'd do every second of my military career over to the final second because I had TRICARE, and the military was there